What follows is 30 minutes of conversation. You will hear a completely other conversation if you listen to Bookworm, an hour-long one that covers the entirety of Mr. Barth's career down to the most recent book come November when the book comes out. In the meantime, here we sit, and these questions come from my intense state of admiration. I wanted to begin by asking, because from, it seems to me, Saltweed Factor on, the books seem to be expressions of truly mammoth self-confidence. And I want to ask where it came from, since you admire.
Since what?
Since you admire the chutzpah.
I thought you were going to say, since you know I have none.
Well, I think of those creatures who appear to you, Hop here, and the boy who comes bearing the revised new syllabus at the beginning of Glasgow Boy, and both times you say you admire their confidence since you have none of your own, and yet the books trumpet.
Yes, and I don't think, Michael, at least I hope I didn't say I have none of my own. I only said that they have a lot of that, and not their chutzpah, which is not the same thing as self-confidence. I suspect, I mean, a fiction writer is a fiction writer, and I suspect that the right answer to your question would be a variation on that. It turns out it's a proverb from theater lore, that notion of the great thing in acting is, the important thing is sincerity. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. And I think in many respects, the important thing when you're dealing with the muse is a certain amount of self-confidence. Once you can fake that, she may continue. More seriously, I suspect that, I mean, my self-confidence, like I would imagine the self-confidence of most people in this invisible audience, we can't see you at all out there, it's very spooky, is that, you know, now it's up, now it's down, now it's up, now it's down. I have known writers who have generalized that most writers, that all writers are they not manic depressives? And I have to say, no. Some are, and God bless them if it works, you know, if whatever floats your boat. Good. If you're manic, you can write about the depressive times in your life, and when you're depressed, try to write about the manic times, and it probably levels out. I guess I'm fairly flat line about that. But it is true, of course, that when you approach any new large project, and if you know from your track record that you're likely to be looking at the same project for the next 4 years, your confidence in that project has to be of some degree, or you wouldn't start it. It's very likely to go up and down there in the course of its completion. But if you are, and people are this way just temperamentally, metabolically, I think, not by choice, a novelist and not a short story writer, you're prepared for the long haul. Our mutual friend Donald Barthelme, who really was basically a short story writer, and who, when he wrote novels, wrote rather thin ones, used to say, how can you write novels, you know? You gotta wait years before you find out how the story's gonna come out, even if you know in advance. And I would say to him, Donald, how can you write short stories? The idea of once every few weeks or months starting from scratch, you know. So these are differences in temperament, I'm sure.
Now, I think there is no book of yours, including the first two, that do not mention the muse. And your acquaintance with her seems to have come early. And unlike any other modern writer I know, you continue to invoke her and to invoke her seriously. I at once thought it was shtick, but it's lasted way too long for shtick. So
it's reified shtick. It's shtick with, I was going to say like a golem, but no, that's the wrong connotation. It's shtick which has taken a life of its own so that it's real. When Plato talks about the muse, and when Homer and those guys, in that wonderfully passive way, as if they're just passive agents of something speaking through them, say, tell me, O muse, I'm not going to tell you, tell me, O muse, sing, O muse, of such and such. That impressed me when I was a youngster discovering literature. I liked the metaphor. The muse is a metaphor, but it's a metaphor for a number of important things. We know that the most self-aware sophisticated, self-conscious, if you like, writers in the whole pantheon or rogues gallery or whatever of literature, we know that even those even for them, the act of writing, like the act of painting, like the act of composing, like the act of many things we do in life, is half hunch and feel. I'm sure a good surgeon, a good anything, much of what you do comes out of training that has become so perfected that it's become second nature, so it's your spine that's thinking about it, or the back of your brain or something. That's the muse, I suppose. On top of that, of course, is my famous love of Scheherazade and of icons of tale-telling. And we don't know, finally, where those things come from. We think we're in control, and I'm not romantic or mystical about these things, but we also know that much that's going on back here and in here and over there and wherever, I think in my kneecap, left kneecap, the muse sometimes is also in charge.
One of the people from the Lannan Foundation asked me to be sure to have you say what it is about Scheherazade that inspires you.
It's a long story, Michael, and if we had 1,001 nights instead of 24 minutes and 59 seconds left, I could perhaps tell you. But to make the long story as short as I can, I came to college, as many another has done, with very little literary background or education. Among my jobs, along with playing in dance bands to pay my tuition, was filing books in the Hopkins Book Library to help defray my tuition. My stacks, Muse be thanked, happened to be the stacks of the Classics Library, the Oriental Seminary, as they called it in those days. That is where you found Arabic literature, Persian literature, Sanskrit literature, in translation, mind you. And there was a service of the university. They hired more people than they need, I'm convinced. They sent us back there, in effect, saying, come back sometime after you've filed these books. And so I was reading what I was putting on the shelf, and I discovered the 1,001 Nights and the Panchatantra and the Vetala Pancha Vimsata and the Kata Sarit Sagara. I love to drop these names because I don't know Sanskrit at all. The Ocean of Story, the 25 Tales Told by a Vampire, all these wonderful collections of tales within tales within tales which have stayed with me. And most of us have discovered Scheherazade in Bowdlerized versions of the Arabian Nights illustrated by N.C. Wyeth. And then it was a revelation to come upon the real thing, you know, the very naughty, very salacious, and yet very wonderful and passionate story of Scheherazade. But it's also, of course, the icon of every storyteller, as I've had occasion to write. Scheherazade's situation with the king, entertain me or it's that, is, metaphorically speaking, every storyteller's situation. We're only as good as our next book. It's not enough to have told 739 stories. If the 740th one isn't good, it's off with your head, or so we think. But while it's a terrifying relation of teller to audience, we learn in that wonderful end of the frame story, it's also a fructifying one. You know, I did an essay on Scheherazade's menstrual cycle once, to which I refer any of you who wanted this, to figure out why it was 1,001 nights. And she comes in with 3 sons, one walking, one crawling, one nursing at the end. Figure it out for yourselves.
Yes, and only Jack Barth would think to ask, what was the story she was telling the night before she gave birth? And, you know, and calculate this, because there's the mathematics side and the fire side. And I don't mean the fire side, I mean the fire side. And, or what was it, calculus and fire? Is that the Borges? Algebra and fire.
Borges' term, yeah.
But it seems to me that from the very beginning, there is an interest in immobility. A friend of mine who reread The End of the Road said to me that about that famous opening in which a man is sitting knee to knee with his immobilization therapist and worried about crossing his legs and touching him, or said, well, why doesn't he move the chair? And Barth's entire career is to spend all of his novels making sure he never makes a mistake like that again by nailing down the chair. The sitting still part seems to me, though, from that opening of The End of the Road, to be the act of the novelist who's stuck face to face with his story and has, if he's to get things done at all, to sit without moving anything but his hand.
And his mind a little bit.
And I wondered about how you learned to do that.
Could I take you on as my muse, Michael? Michael has a way of disarming all of us by understanding our books better than we do, and by, of course, because he comes to them from outside the business of having produced them, but having inside him a massive range of reference and a formidable memory. Those of us who write the damn things tend to go on to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. Our memory of those things before gets... That was not the opening scene, Michael. In the opening scene, the chap, this is a novel, mind you, that I wrote in 3 months when I was 24, 25 years old, so don't hold me too responsible for it. But in the opening scene, the chap is immobilized in Pennsylvania Station in Baltimore. And then in the first therapy scene, he's knee to the doctor like that. I like what you've done with that metaphor, which never occurred to me till now. This is what readers are for. I was going to say critics and reviewers, but no. This is what readers are for. One learns so much after publishing a novel sometimes that one wish one had knew beforehand, or you could have made it a better novel from the things that readers write in to tell you. It had never occurred to me, crossed my heart until you said it now, that position of Jacob Horner in the chair, knee to therapist, could, in a very grim way, be seen as the position of writer in chair, of what, knee to knee with the muse? That sounds like fun, so it can't be that. Knee to knee with the muse. Scriptotherapy was one of his therapies, of course, but that novel was a long time ago.
And yet it seems to me true that the strategies for narrative are about immobilization.
Explain that, Michael.
I will. It is an obligation, for instance, in the Perseid, that Perseus and Calixa, if I remember correctly, be seated at exactly a point that allows the murals to unfold and the galaxies to be seen above them. Right. There's frequently the immobilization of storytelling. Dunyazad's position at the foot of the bed in the Dunyazadiad, hearing the story. There is a fixing. And, oh, thank you for asking, as a matter of fact, because I often think that fixing is on your mind. In The Gals Goat Boy, one of the hero's tasks is to fix the clock. The image, right? Fix the clock, which ends up meaning fix it in place. It's not moving. He's not meant to make it go around. He's meant to leave it the way it is, fixed, constantly at the same time. And so there is a kind of interest in holding things at place while the chaotic world whirls around.
I want to whip out my pen and write that down before I forget it so that I can use it, because it occurs to me as Michael's talking that the other figure in the Perseus-Calixa story of mine, as well as in the Greek myth, is Medusa, than whom nobody was better at fixing things in position. I mean, you look at Medusa, whom Freud saw as an image of what, male impotence or terror or something like that, but whom writers just like to see as an image of statue making or something. It occurs to me too that finally what we're doing, all of us who paint, who write, who compose music, is fixing in that photographic sense that you describe, fixing what's been on our minds and on our muses' minds into a kind of finished position. This is the thing, by the way, that in electronic fiction goes by the board, for better or worse. There are no final texts in cyber fiction, as for better or worse. There are things to be admired there. Yes, we're all fixers. Now work that into Malamud's novel entitled The Fixer and see if we can...
I can't do everything.
And we take a fix. Mind you too, I'm an amateur sailor. One of Shelley's my pleasures is sailing. And many metaphors come from that, of course, that apply to writers. Deduced reckoning, where we decide where we're going to go next as a writer by determining where we are as a writer, by reviewing where we've been as a writer, which is just about, and we do that in life too all the time, what I will do next in my life depends on what I think I'm doing now in my life, which largely we determine from seeing the trajectory that we've followed thus far. But there is also that business in navigation of taking a fix, which means fixing our position in a sense that's different from either of the two we've used so far. Fixing our position by taking bearings on from different.
Well, in fact, in the last voyage of Somebody the Sailor, somebody, a representative from our century, is called upon at moment's notice, really, to learn to use Arabic medieval sextant and learn to fix his course.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, but it's never a coincidence, it seems to me, in Barth to find both stability and change. I say that Barth has never done the same thing twice, but there are others who say that you manage not to do the same thing twice by doing the same thing over and over again, but differently. And I wondered if you would comment on those reorchestrations.
Indeed, I'll be glad to, because I have a fund of wonderful comments because they're not mine. One of the pleasures of not only of having conversations with people like Michael, but of having presided, having worked in universities where part of my job description was to bring writers in, as the Lannan Foundation does here. And I've picked up so many useful little fortunes for writers and for myself from what they've said. What was your question?
Doing the same thing over and over.
Doing the same thing over and over again. That Italo Calvino, whom we both admire enormously, the late, much lamented Italo Calvino, told my students, and I think he's written it in one of his essays, that a writer is, after all, dealt, as it were, a hand of cards. It's not a limitless hand of cards. And Calvino, who was big on combinatorial fictions, recombining certain images to get different effects, said in effect, and in his troubled English, that what we do finally is just, we all writers, we just reshuffle the same hand of cards. That's okay with me. The number of permutations is finite, but it's very large.
I want to talk to you about happiness, because I know I'm sensing the same... About? Happiness.
Happiness.
Happiness. Oh, no, because you see, it seems to me that one of the great... I'm about to say delicacies, which I'm sure is the wrong word, of reading the second half of Barth's career is that happiness is...
Struck,
yes. And you see, I had friends who loved Barth as much as I did. My problem with Barth was, how could he seem as troubled as he was and still write those novels? When I got that upset, I couldn't do anything at all, right?
But you said I was self-confident.
And this particular young man who loved the grim dilemmas that young men in Barth faced became unhappy when Barth seemed to become happy. He didn't want to go to fiction to find relief. He wanted to be in constant strife. And Tolstoy, of course, said that all happy families are the same. It seemed like a warning to fiction writers. And so one
of the great opening sentences and one of the great misstatements in the history of literature and human observations, I think, that happy families are right. Continue, Michael.
But I wondered about your fears when happiness struck.
My fears when happiness struck. I suspect that the grimness of the first two novels, the Floating Opera in the Air, which are what I was thinking in my mid-20s, were not. People in their mid-20s can be very black about life, you know. And if one is fortunate enough to survive as a human being and as an artist in any medium through enough decades, I think the prospect of one's not all that far off mortality takes the place of the kind of thing that was giving one a rather dark view of things in one's boisterous, self-confident mid-20s, so that mere joy may struck in. Who am I thinking of? Was it Joyce Carey who wrote the novel Surprised by Joy? No, it was herself surprised. Who wrote?
That's a book of criticism by Stanley Fish, isn't it?
Very good. I bet not, but it might be. Surprised by joy. One can be sometimes surprised by joy, and one doesn't want to get farther into that on a public stage, whether it can be a change in one's life. We know that sometimes when writers and other artists, when their life becomes happy, their art becomes sloppy. And some writers see to it that they get unhappy again one way or another. So in vain hope, I think, that they might get back to the kind of tough work that they were doing when they were miserable. But I don't have that romantic view of creation. I think it applies to some cases. Anything applies to some artist or other somewhere in the world, but one must be extremely cautious of generalizations about out of what conditions good art comes, even within the same writer, not to mention from writer to writer, even in the same writer from book to book or painting to painting or what have you. If there is less blackness and more joy, or at least delight or happiness described by the characters in my other books, it's not because nobody's dying still. I mean, you got to kill off a character now and then to keep the payroll lean. Downsizing, I think they call it in other parts of the world.
Because
further than that, deponent saith not.
I often find myself prey to the proof in my life of metaphysical ideas. The ones that people are contemptuous of Californians for holding. But it seems to me that your happy picture of the muse prefigured the arrival of the wife these books celebrate again and again, and maybe offering contemporary literature's sole continuous picture of happy marriage.
God knows whether that's true. It would be a distinction I would be glad to claim, even if it weren't so, if it were only one among some others. We have to remember that among the muses, classically, there was the one with the grin and the one with the grimace, both of whom inspired artists back in classical times to do extraordinary work. I don't think I have enough of the muse with the grin in me. I think she's basically my muse. Not to have written anything that could be called a tragic work. Tragic comedy, the mixture of tragedy and comedy, the mixture of pity and terror and mirth, I think, that we see in writers like Don Quixote, in writers like Cervantes' Don Quixote, are certainly closer to my spirit than the muses either of Aristophanes on the one hand with his comedies, or Sophocles and company on the other hand with their tragedies. God knows, I would not want, Muse knows, I would not want ever to write a book of mine that had nothing funny in it. I think The End of the Road, my darkest book, is also a funny book in many ways. I hope so. I think that On with the Story, a series of stories that's framed by a story about a couple who are facing some kind of terminality unnamed, finally is a positive, not in the way that catharsis by pity and terror is positive. I think there's comedy in there too. I hope so.
If there is anyone, in fact, in this room who, like me, went through a period of not reading Barth because critics said he had flagged, which was my case, and I'm terribly embarrassed by it. I got a reasonable sized book in the mail called On with the Story, and I said, I'll read John Barth again. And, you know, the return to an old friend, I quickly went back to read all the Barth I'd missed, and people lie to you, but that is the other consequence of metaphysics. People create that reality by invoking it in language, so be careful what you say. People will believe you. I believed a generation of literary critics that didn't know how to read second cycle Barth, and so I'd missed out for years on the chance to reread second cycle Barth, but I had the pleasure of making friends anew with him. But this book astonished me. By the time you reach its last 30 pages, so many things happen in it and to you as a result that I felt, pardon me, transfigured.
Transfigured. To transfigure Michael Silverblatt is no small accomplishment. And transfiguration always has positive connotations, Michael, so I will presume and hope and thank you for the compliment that the transfiguration with a positive transfiguration, and
it brought me
and not
back to life and you back to life for me. What could be better?
sounds good to me.
So this was the last book. Coming Soon is coming soon, and since its subject, as we heard, is the competition, rivalry, collaboration, sometimes with a younger writer, I thought it would be appropriate to beat the herd who are going to ask you about the company of younger writers.
And what exactly is the question about the company of younger writers?
Do you feel, is there a rivalry, a competition with them? Do you feel in collaboration? Are there any participating in your own ambitions, furthering the work that you began?
No, there are writers. I've always had navigation stars since I was an apprentice writer. There are and I've liked the metaphor that I borrow again from sailing, that you do not mistake your navigation stars for your destination. I mean, these are compass points that you steer by, but you're not trying to be Joyce or Beckett or Nabokov or Calvino or Borges just because you steer by those stars. They help you fix your own position, to use that word again, and so forth. I have had the good fortune at 2 or 3 universities, but especially at Johns Hopkins, where I coached. It's not teaching anymore at that point, it's coaching a number of young writers this far away from professionality, whom we pick for their talent in the first place, and enjoy that enormously. It's enormously labor intensive, because closing those last 3 millimeters between talented student work and things that you should be showing to an editor instead of to a teacher can be the hardest thing of all. And most of them don't make it, but many of them do. That's delightful, and though I don't miss line editing manuscripts anymore, I miss that kind of association. Well, mind you, let me say quickly, I've never had a protege with whom I had any kind of connection, like J. Hopkins Johnson in that thing I just told you. No, that kind of rivalry and even friendly competitiveness is foreign to my experience indeed. I have had and continue to have, I saw some of them in my short stay in Santa Fe already, an enormous ongoing avuncular pride in their success, and enough of them have been successful for that pride to be ongoing. Never a rivalry. They're now getting away from former proteges, mentees, students, what have you. I do not attempt to stay au courant with all that's going on the fictional scene. One advantage of academic retirement is I can go back and read all of Rabelais again if I want to, because I don't have all those manuscripts to read. It's still a first priority of mine to read the published works as they come in from my former students. Those of you who may be in the audience will remember that my rule on parting with you was, never show me another unpublished line of yours, please, ever, but send me all your published works so that I can be proud of them. And they do that. That's the first budget. But then there are younger writers. You've had some of them here, whom I admire enormously, whom in some cases I not only admire, but can outright envy, knowing that they're doing things that I do not think I could do. They're out of my capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean better. Sometimes it means better. It may just mean other than I, so that I can have the reassuring feeling as I approach my seniority, as I go through my seniority, that American literature, not even to mention the literature of other countries, is in pretty good hands. That is, there's some pretty cool people writing out there who are going to keep things going after the generation of us who were first called existentialists, then we were called black humorists, then we were called fabulists, then we were called postmodernists, and no doubt the name of the boat has changed again. But when we all have passed along, and some of us have already, there are a lot of good stuff being written out there. American literature still has its vitality.
If I were in the audience as a young person right now, I would want to ask, who?
You will have to find out for yourselves, because it will not Well, in the last year, I've read novels by Richard Powers, who has been here, for example, a young writer I admire very much. The British Jamaican Zadie Smith. I thought White Teeth was a very funny book indeed, a good book indeed. I've read books by near contemporaries of mine, but not quite contemporaries, like John Updike, for example, and Don DeLillo, that I have enjoyed. And others who I am forgetting to mention.
Some 10, 15 years ago, I was starting to read a book called What is the Name of This Book by Raymond Smullyan, and I thought, if John Barth doesn't know this book, how I wish I were able to pick up the phone and call John Barth and tell him about this book. Because it not only has logic puzzles, it explains logic puzzles and teaches you the origin of logic of this puzzling sort while indulging in extracurricular examination of the all Cretans are liars principles. And sure enough, when at last the books of essays appeared, I found the Friday books in which Barth writes about his current interests. I wondered, are there books of that kind? One was Darcy Thompson's Growth and Form at one point. Books about symmetries and dissymmetries. What are some of the others that have been your other navigation
Well, we
points?
mentioned Joseph, in our conversation earlier today, we mentioned Joseph Campbell's Richard, the Birth of what is it called, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and so forth, which certainly obsessed my imagination. More often, though, it's been writers, those navigation stars I mentioned, than these certainly important non-writers. Our time is up, I see by the clock, but I don't want to I don't want us to end this conversation without saying, because we mentioned these wonderful logical paradoxers like Smullyan, right on back to Zeno, who fascinate me and whose thinking like that has been important in entertaining me while I'm fixed at the desk and entertaining my muse. But it's been an article of faith in my workshop that while formal virtuosity and playful sporting with the narrative variations on this ancient and honorable art of storytelling, as old as anything human, for me, finally, the idea is to get the story told and to tell a story that will keep the king from going like this tomorrow morning so that I can tell another story tomorrow. After all, Scheherazad's formal trick of stopping in the middle of a sentence, which I think that beeper was just telling us to do, was a trick for going on with the story.
I wonder, though, if we can finish by saying something together that you said so many times in the past. Although heartfelt ineptitude has its appeal, and so does heartless skill. But what you want is, and now together, passionate virtuosity.